So we've now replaced our relatively simple set of observations about things that can and can't occur in a particular language with this elaborate theory of constraints and their interaction and the rich base and any possible input and any possible output. And it seems like things are much more complicated now. So one of the questions is, why are we doing this? Why are we adopting this kind of Baroque theory of phonology? And the answer is largely that this theory makes strong predictions about typology in a way that other theories of phonology do not and cannot. Right? So, if we were just trying to describe Korean, this would be a crazy theory with all of the optimality theoretic tableau and everything like that. If we were just trying to describe two languages, it would still be a lot of machinery just for that. But the idea is that optimality theory has a built-in way of limiting what kinds of languages are possible and impossible. This is desirable because when we look at phonological distributions across languages, we don't find every possible arrangement of features that you could imagine. We only find a very limited subset. We went through, for this particular feature, all 6 possible rankings of our 3 constraints on the anterior feature. We saw that there are 6 rankings because any of the 3 constraints can be ranked highest. Once you've done that, any of the 2 remaining ones can be ranked second, and then you only have 1 choice left for the third, so it's 3 times 2 times 1, or factorial, 3 factorial. That's why we call it factorial typology. In this case, there's 6 possible grammars, 6 possible rankings, and they only generate 4 different languages. Those 4 different languages, or those 4 different distributions of the anterior feature, correspond to exactly the phonological distributions that we've looked at in this class. And that was a nice result. Of course, there are other logically possible kinds of languages or kinds of distributions that you might imagine with the feature anterior. OT analysis with this particular constraint set claims that these other languages don't and can't exist, that they're impossible languages. Right? So when you couple the optimality theory framework with a specific theory of what's in the constraints, you get strong predictions about what kinds of languages do and don't exist. And that's a much higher goal for our phonology, theory of phonology, than just being able to describe things that happen in different languages. This is trying to describe not only what happens in different languages, but limits on what happens across languages. So here's one example having to do with context-free markedness. So our constraint set included a constraint on esh, on the non-anterior fricative, but not a general markedness constraint against sa, against the anterior fricative. So we did not have a constraint against the anterior fricative sa, not a general markedness constraint, only a context-free markedness constraint against the minus anterior one. So what can we predict just with that? The existence of this constraint, but the non-existence of this one? Well, this predicts that we could find a language where this sound is just not allowed, but this one is. And in fact, that's Spanish, basically, most varieties of Spanish. So you can get words like beso, but there's no word like beso. You can get words like sin, but there's no word like shin, and so on and so forth, right? So this is basically the Spanish pattern. And that's good. We predict that language exists. But there's no way to derive a language using these constraints that has an esh sound, but no sa sound, right? You can imagine, logically, a language that looks a lot like Spanish, except it has words like beso and shin, and no words like beso and sin. The claim of this particular constraint set is that there is no such language in the world. And actually, as far as I know, this is roughly correct. it wouldn't shock me if you came in tomorrow with a language that actually was a counterexample. And if that happened, then we'd need to revise our theory of the constraint set. And maybe we would abandon the idea that there are context-free restrictions on the distribution of this anteriority feature. But at least we can make predictions like this if we need to. So this is not a totally firm typological generalization. I wouldn't be shocked to find out it's wrong, but it actually does hold for just about all the languages I can think of, which is a lot of languages. There's a slightly more complex set of typological predictions here as well, and that's because our constraint set included the constraint don't have an anterior fricative before a high front vowel. So we had this constraint, star C. We did not have a constraint, star she. And if this is right, if we have a context-sensitive Markowitz constraint like this, but none like this also circumscribes the kinds of natural languages that can exist with regard to the distribution of the anterior feature. Right? So we saw already that this constraint predicts there will be some languages that will neutralize the contrast between S and Sh before the E vowel. And it also predicts that the outcome will always be she, right? And never C, because that's what's being marked by the constraint. And we saw that this holds in Korean and Japanese. There's many other languages where it holds as well. What kinds of languages does the existence of this constraint and the non-existence of this one rule out? Well, there's several answers. One is imagine a language like Korean Prime, where all of the words look like Korean words. Let me get my Korean data here. Except instead of having the non-anterior one before E and the anterior one elsewhere, that's reversed. So in Korean Prime, we have words like shawl and shasheojo or shasheoyo, and words like shen. But we don't have, before the vowel E, we only get the anterior one, and we end up with sik and si and sijan, and so on and so forth. So this is Korean Prime. That's just like Korean, but the contexts of the anteriority alternation are reversed. And the claim of this constraint set is that Korean Prime doesn't exist and is an impossible language. Now this one, I'm a little bit more certain that this is correct. I am virtually certain that if you go out across the world and scour every language you can find on every continent, you're never going to find a language that works like this. Of course, it's possible that I'm wrong, but I'm more certain about this one than I am about the context-free example. So this is one example of a kind of language that can't exist according to this constraint set. Another example would be a language that allows the contrast between S and Sh before this high front vowel E, but neutralizes it elsewhere to either value. Right? It doesn't matter whether it neutralizes it to sh or to sa. There is no language, given this constraint set, that will allow a contrast between umsik and umshik, but ban one of these before other vowels. This language also doesn't exist. You could call that one Japanese Prime, where it's a positional neutralization, but in the wrong context. And so these are just two examples. You could come up with all sorts of other patterns that this constraint set predicts should be impossible. And my claim here is that each one of those logically possible, but ruled out languages is a language that in reality does not exist. And this is why optimality theory is a strong theory of typology, and it's why we pursue it in this class, despite the fact that it's kind of complicated. Now, as you can see from what I've been doing up here, the predictions about which kinds of languages are possible and impossible, which I'm basically saying is the entire point of doing optimality theory, depend entirely on what's in the constraint set. Right? So I sort of declared, based on looking at some languages, that this must be a context-sensitive markedness constraint, but we didn't see any need for this one, so we didn't posit it. More generally, we'd like to have some theory of why we have some constraints and not others, right? Where are these constraints coming from? And that's what I'm going to talk about in the rest of this lecture.